Welcome everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start with a little bit of fun. We're going to start with a March Madness bracket. We know that's that time of year, and we're going to do that with football teams. We're going to do a little twist on it, so we're going to do what would happen if all of these teams played in 2023. Then we're going to jump into Chris Sims had some wide receiver rankings come out for the 2024 class, and they are kind of a doozy, so we'll get into all of that. Then we're going to get into breakout players on the offensive side of the ball. This is part 3 of this edition. There are so many guys that are ready to step into some big shoes or just be bigger parts of their team's future in 2024 that we will get into. And then finally, we will finish it off with a Top 10 Tuesday. Today, we're going to keep going on the basketball football route. We're going to do schools in 2023 and 2024, that academic year, that have set the pace for everyone else. The top 10 teams in basketball and football this year, some teams that obviously made the tournament but also had some success on the football field. So before we jump in, though, I do want to remind you all that we get a ton of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your comments on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to see your questions on the screen, and maybe I can answer them. We can have a fun back and forth here. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in because it is March Madness time. It is one of my favorite times of the year. We have tons of incredible basketball on the way, my favorite postseason of really any sport, and everyone's talking about basketball. But I did see something on the Cover 3 pod, one of the great pods in college football right now, that is they went through the bracket and they decided who would win on a football field. So if these football teams were to face off in 2023, how would it shake out and who would be your eventual national champion? So that's what we're going to do. We have a ton of teams to watch. We have a ton to get to. But let's start with the top half of the bracket here. And let's start with the East. So the big division, the one with UConn as the number 1 overall seed, the one where Virginia went down to a 16 seed all that time ago. But this is the football edition, so let's get to that. We got, first of all, Jim Mora and UConn would get a quick win over Stetson in the first round, move on to the round of 32. Tom Herman and the FAU Owls would not be able to handle Northwestern, I don't think. They had a very good year under David Braun, who then got hired, so I think Northwestern would win that one. San Diego State runs a very interesting offense, a lot of quarterback runs with Jalen Mayden. I think they would be able to knock off UAB, although that'd be a very, very tough fight against Trent Dover's squad down there in Birmingham. But then we continue down the list, and this is where the blowouts start to happen. We have Auburn dominating Yale, Baylor over Duquesne, Illinois knocks off Morehead State, Cam Ward and Wazoo knock off Drake. So all of these games pretty cut and dry. I don't think there's any question there. And then we get to the fun one, the 15-2 South Dakota State against Iowa State. And I got to be honest, I think it would be a tough matchup, and I think Iowa State might just come out on top. But at the end of the day, there's only a couple of national title champions at the end of the year. So South Dakota State deserves their respect. They move on to the next round and start a little bit of a run here. We have South Dakota State obviously continuing their run against Cam Ward and Washington. They move on to play BYU, who I think would knock off Illinois in a very, very tough defensive battle. Auburn would knock off San Diego State with not much trouble there. And then UConn would fall to Northwestern. David Braun, again, did a great job this year, so I think he would set up a matchup with Auburn that would not go his way. I think that Auburn offensive line and defensive line would just be too much for Northwestern. I think Auburn would win that one and move on to the Elite Eight, where they'd be joined by the Jackrabbits. Again, this is a team that won a title. This is a team that deserves some respect, and they're definitely getting it here. They move on to the Elite Eight, where they'll face off against Auburn, and this is a game where I'm about 100% confident that Auburn would win this game, but at the end of the day, South Dakota State, deserves their respect. They went undefeated. They won the FCS. I got to move them on to the Final Four. So they come out of the East Division, and then we get to the South Division, the one right across. Houston is coming in with a lot of energy into the tournament, but that doesn't much matter in ours because there is a lot of different things at stake. They do roll in the first round over Longwood. A&M beats a tough Nebraska team, but I think Connor Wegman would make enough plays in that game for them to get that win. Then we would go to Wisconsin, likely beating James Madison, although I kind of feel bad about that pick. I feel like James Madison did deserve some respect after the year they had, but I think I would still go Badgers in that matchup. Duke would get an easy win over Vermont, and then we get into some really, really good matchups. Texas Tech against NC State would be just an awesome game. I think it would be incredible, but I think Peyton Wilson in that Wildcat defense would just be a little bit too much for Texas Tech. I think they would get the win there. Kentucky would roll over Oakland. Florida would beat Colorado, I think, by a hair, although the talent of Colorado would make that very, very interesting. I think that would be a super fun game to watch if we ever got that one in 2023. And then Western Kentucky would beat a non-existent team from Chicago in Marquette, so they would just be playing alone on a field, so that helps a little bit for them. A&M, I think, beats Houston pretty comfortably to go to the Sweet 16. Duke wins a tough battle over Wisconsin. I think Duke's defense would just be too much for that Wisconsin offense that never really found their footing in 2023. And then you got Kentucky. I think they would beat NC State. I think that D-line of Kentucky would be pretty dominant, and I think Ray Davis would have a day. So I think Kentucky would win a close one there. Florida beats Western Kentucky in an absolute shootout, in my opinion. I think Western Kentucky is a team that absolutely could have made a run. Obviously, Malachi Corley, the remarkable wide receiver that's now going into the draft, would have played a big part in that game if that were to happen. And then Kentucky beats Florida because they beat Florida this year, so that one's not too hard to figure out. I think Duke would knock off. I think Duke would knock off Kentucky or knock off Texas A&M in a very, very tough one. That one's very interesting, of course, because Duke and Mike Elko would be facing off against the team that he is just about to play, and then they would head on to face Kentucky, where I think Kentucky would get the win. I think there's a big argument to be made for Duke. Obviously, these are two blue bloods in the basketball game, but not so much in the football game. But I think both these guys are incredible. I would lean Kentucky on the line of scrimmage, so I would say Kentucky wins this region and heads on to the Final Four to join South Dakota State. Then we'll go down to the bottom half of the bracket. We have so many good matchups in this part of the bracket. I think the West is particularly interesting. We start with North Carolina rolling over Howard with Drake May going absolutely crazy. Then we have Mississippi State, I think, would win a battle of the MSUs against Michigan State. St. Mary's and Grand Canyon do not have a team, so I'm just going to go with the higher seed in St. Mary's there, and it's pretty much Bama rolling straight to the Sweet 16 because Bama would get a big win over Charleston and then would play a non-existent team. So they would roll on to the Sweet 16 pretty quickly. Clemson would get a big win over New Mexico. I think Baylor would kill Colgate. Nevada beats Dayton. Arizona and Noah Fafita roll over Long Beach State. And then we get into the second round. North Carolina beats Mississippi State in what I think would be kind of a battle, but Drake May would just be too much for that. I think, obviously, Alabama would win over the non-existent St. Mary's. Clemson, I think, would get the win over Baylor, and then Arizona would get a big win over Nevada to move them on to the Sweet 16 as well. Then we would have a very good couple of matchups. North Carolina against Bama. This is just too much for Drake May in North Carolina. I think Bama would definitely get the win here. And then Arizona, I think, would beat Clemson in an offensive battle. I think Noah Fafita would have an absolute day. And that Arizona defense was absolutely no slouch last year. So I think Arizona would move on to the Elite Eight to face Alabama, where their season would end, where their fun would end, because this Bama team would just be too physical, I think, for that Arizona team. But at the end of the day, this game would have been incredible to watch last year because two very different styles, two really good quarterbacks. I think it would have been a lot of fun, and possibly we could see that as a playoff matchup this upcoming year in 2024. But let's move to the Midwest. because this is a very interesting bracket. Some teams that don't have teams, that's kind of the case sometimes with the March Madness teams, but at the end of the day, let's get underway here. We got Purdue obviously getting a big time win in their first round matchup. TCU gets a big time win over Utah State. McNeese beats a non-existent Gonzaga team, and Jalen Daniels and Kansas beat up on Samford to move to the second round. Then we got Oregon knocking off South Carolina. I think that would be a fun game, but Bo Nix and Oregon's offense would just be too much. Akron beats a non-existent team from Creighton. Texas likely beats up on either Virginia or Colorado State. I think those could be somewhat interesting games, but I think Texas would likely pull away in the second half. And then Tennessee beats up on St. Peter's, who, again, does not have a team. So a couple of these teams are getting some buys here in the early rounds, but now the fun really starts in this division. We have TCU against Purdue. I think that would be a really fun game. It would be Hudson Card against a team that he used to play when he was at Texas and TCU. But I think TCU would definitely get the win there. And I think Kansas would roll to the Sweet 16 over McNeese. And then we get to the bottom half. And Oregon, I think, would beat up on Akron. And then Texas would win the Battle of the UTs in an SEC preview game over Tennessee. I think that one would be pretty close. I think Joe Milton would make just enough mistakes for the Texas defense to take advantage of, and they would continue rolling on. Then we get to two games that are going to be absolutely awesome. Well, TCU and Kansas. I think Kansas beats TCU to get to the Elite Eight, and then Oregon against Texas might be the best game in this entire bracket. I think that's a game that everyone really wanted to see. Both teams lost to Washington in very, very close games. Both teams had very good quarterbacks and very good offenses. I think it's a game that everyone would have loved to see throughout the college football season, but I'd lean Texas in that game. I think Oregon's offensive line and defensive line would not necessarily be up to the task of taking care of Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, so I'd lean Texas to win that one, to then beat Kansas because, well, they beat Kansas in the Elite Eight and then move on to the Final Four. So we finally have a Final Four, and it looks something like this. We have South Dakota State coming up against Alabama, and I gotta say, as much respect as I have for South Dakota State, I think they would get pretty much manhandled by Alabama, so I'd have to go with the Crimson Tide there. And then I think Texas beats Kentucky by a fairly good margin. I think their defensive line would have quite the day, honestly, against the Kentucky O-line. And then we would get a fun little rematch. We would get Bama against Texas, the rematch from the game in Tuscaloosa that Texas was able to take and kind of set their season off into what it ended up being, and a game that, funnily enough, we were literally a couple of plays in each of those semifinal games from getting as our national title in football. So very interesting how all of this worked out, but again, Texas beat Bama, so I feel like I have to go in the Longhorns' direction. I think if this were to play out without Georgia, without Ohio State, without Penn State, without LSU, without all of these incredible teams in the field, Michigan, obviously the national champion in football, not in the field in basketball, so that helped out Texas a little bit here, but I think Texas would be the national champions if they played it out on the football field and not on the basketball court. Now, I am not endorsing they play these games on a football field because that is far too many games in far too short a period of time, but it's always a fun exercise when we get to this time of year to kind of blur the lines between the two sports and bring together what I think is the best postseason to the best regular season in college football. So a lot of really, really fun games throughout this one. I think Texas A&M, Nebraska in the opening round, obviously a Big 12 throwback, which was awesome. Texas, Oregon, I talked about, I think would have been an incredible game to watch last year. Texas, Tennessee, always a fun one when those guys get to match up. And then Alabama, Arizona is right up there with Texas, Oregon for games that I really, really wanted to see last year, but just wasn't in the card. So I think this was a very fun exercise. We had a ton of very interesting matchups, a ton of teams that win a little bit further than they probably will go this time around in the basketball tournament, like South Dakota State. But at the end of the day, three of these teams, well, mainly two. I don't know if Texas is going to make a Final Four run, but Kentucky and Alabama absolutely have a shot to follow this little run up and this non-existent, not important exercise. They could follow it up with something very important in a Final Four run of their own. So a lot of fun this time of year. I think it's one of my favorite weeks of the year, being able to watch all of the games all at once, have as many TVs up as I possibly can. But I thought I would take it to the football side of things and kind of blur the lines a little bit and enjoy it a little bit. But this is an incredible time of year. I think March Madness is just awesome, so definitely enjoy it. I think this one's going to be particularly crazy with not a ton of teams that are kind of separating themselves from the pack. Obviously, UConn is just an absolute powerhouse, but beyond that, it feels like it's pretty wide open. So definitely enjoy this. Get all your TVs going. Get everything on. But for now, we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Chris Sims. We did his breakdown of the quarterback rankings in this upcoming 2024 draft. Now it's time for wide receivers, and these are a little bit more contentious than the quarterback ones, I'll be honest. So definitely stick with us, and we will be right back after this.